All right, I've got 1 p.m. on the dot, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Hi, and welcome everyone to the Office of Professional Services and Human Capital Categories Office Hour webinar. My name is Carla Kowar, and I am a program specialist within the PSHC portfolio. Today's topic is exploring new SINs on the Mass Professional Services category with guest speaker Bill Neese. Before we get started today, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, today's presentation and CLPs will be emailed out to you. If you can give us about 2 to 3 business days, we'll make sure those are emailed out. In the event that you do not receive either the presentation or the CLPs, you can email us at cam@gsa.gov. That's cam@gsa.gov, and we'll be sure to send those over to you. Also, please note that phone lines are muted at certain times, or due to a smaller sized audience, we may unmute the lines. We ask you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to ask questions, and we'll answer them throughout the presentation and at the end of the presentation as well. Lastly, a post-event survey will also be emailed out to you. We kindly request or ask you to just take a few minutes and fill that out for us. It'll really help us improve our office hours webinars. All right, with that, I'd like to introduce today's guest speaker, Bill Neese. Bill is a project manager at GSA's Office of Professional Service and Human Capital Categories. In this role, he works with GSA teammates, federal customers, vendors, and other stakeholders to promote the use of GSA's professional services solutions like MAS, PS, and OASIS. Bill brings a variety of perspective on the federal acquisition process to GSA. He joined GSA in November 2020 after 18 years at the Department of Homeland Security, 2 years at ICE, and 16 years at TSA, serving in core and acquisition program manager roles. Prior to DHS, Bill worked as a mid-level manager at Verizon Communication as a management consultant to both government and corporate customers. He began his federal career at FEMA in 1984 as a presidential management intern. Bill lives in Leesburg, Virginia. In addition to farm chores, Bill enjoys bicycling, playing drums and the percussion for the worship team at his church, and he enjoys watching his son play baseball. With that, I will hand it over to you, Bill.
Hey, thanks so much, Carla. I've got to make sure I get your preference for the right gift card, whether it's Starbucks or some other place, but that was very kind. Well, good afternoon, folks. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk with you about some of the changes that GSA recently made to the professional services category under MAS. The slide that you see now is just kind of a table setter slide, just to kind of remind you of some of the points about these office hours webinars that Carla has already mentioned. And the focus today is going to be on some of the recent changes that GSA made to the multiple awards schedule via MAS refresh number 7. And what I'm going to do is create a conversation with all of you about, with respect to professional services, 2 new SINs that we've added to the schedule, as well as modifications or changes that we made to the SIN description for an existing SIN. So with that, let's take a look at today's agenda. I won't go into detail on all of the changes that GSA introduced through MAS refresh number 7. Those of you who are familiar with the refresh process know that GSA does this periodically to promulgate changes contract-wide. An example most recently, I think this week or last week, was refresh number 8 that talked to the COVID requirements for federal contractors. So this was the previous refresh number 7. There were some kind of under the hood procurement changes that were made to the schedule, some specific to a category. I'm going to talk again about professional services. We'll wrap things up with questions and answers, and then talk about some next steps before we adjourn. As Carla mentioned, if you think of questions that you want to present to us or introduce a topic for discussion, please use the Q&A function in this webinar. And if you come up with some questions for us after the webinar concludes, there's a couple of email addresses that you can use to get those questions to us. And I've included my email address as well. So by way of overview, we made the changes to the contract, the MAS, in August of 2021. There were some under the hood contract administration changes and whatnot that we did before we rolled these changes out. One of the other things I wanted to mention before we dive in is that GSA really does have kind of a deliberate process that we go through before we introduce these changes to the vendor and customer stakeholder communities. And we also had a webinar back in mid-August with the vendor community to give them a preview of the proposed changes. So some of these under the hood changes that I'm referencing that apply to all large categories under MAS have to do with the available offerings attachment, the price proposal template, and some other clause and provision updates. When you get the slide deck from today's presentation, you'll see backup slides that explore and expand on these three topics. With respect to specific categories or subcategories, GSA in refresh number 7 made changes to 5 of the categories. We're going to drill into the professional services category. We revised under the environmental services subcategory, we revised SIN 562112, which is for hazardous waste disposal services. And we added 2 new SINs. First, under the financial services subcategory, a new SIN 524292 INS. And under the technical and engineering services subcategory, we added a new SIN 541990, which may be a very familiar SIN or NAICS code to all of you. So let's take a look at the first change that GSA executed. This one has to do with the hazardous waste disposal services SIN. So you start with the first question, why? Why did GSA introduce this change or pursue it? Well, we did some market research. We looked at agency customer requirements and buying habits, and we saw a good amount of unmanaged spend taking place at the tier 0 level. We looked on eBuyOpen at procurement actions and trends. And what we decided to promote was adding to the SIN description medical and pharmaceutical waste disposal and disposal of low-level radiological waste associated with medical waste. And we'll dive into that a little bit more detail in the following slides. So what does this mean for vendors on schedule and for agency customers? Well, for vendors, what it means is we're going to ask them to give us a little bit more documentation regarding medical and pharmaceutical waste disposal, essentially to make sure that they are qualified contractors to do that kind of work for federal customers. And you can see there some examples of the documentation requirements that GSA is going to be looking for. For agency customers like you, what we've started moving on are creating and promulgating tools that will help you procure these kinds of services. Already available now on gsa.gov is a really brief ordering guide for SIN 562112. Second thing we've been working on, which we believe has been very popular with government customers like yourselves, are additional resources that we're going to put in an acquisition planning package. If you look at that website now on gsa.gov, you'll probably notice that an APP for environmental services is not yet available. We hope over the next couple of weeks to get that produced, approved, and rolled out so that you can start using and referencing that material and those resources. Specifically, these are a couple of shots of tools that may be useful to you, and you probably are already aware of them. On the left-hand side is the table of contents for that new ordering guide that I mentioned. And on the right-hand side is the handy-dandy multiple award schedule quick reference ordering guide. And you can see the URLs at the bottom of the page for both of those. Wanted to give you a sneak peek at the acquisition planning package page. As you can see, this will look very familiar to those of you who've used our acquisition planning packages for other subcategories within professional services, as well as other categories under mass. So we've got market research tools for you, sample RFIs, task order templates, BPA templates, and then continuing to the next slide, some of the real important parts of your procurement package, such as sample statements of work and performance work statements. So look forward to making use of that in the coming weeks, and we'll issue a communication to the federal acquisition workforce when they're available. I know this is a really busy slide, but the first new SIN that we've added, this is a really busy slide, but essentially what I'm trying to do is show you what the SIN description is for SIN 562112, Hazardous Waste Disposal Services. And highlighted in yellow are the simple changes that GSA made in order to add medical waste, pharmaceutical waste, and low-level radioactive waste associated with medical waste. On the right-hand side, also probably familiar to all of you, are the mass terms and conditions for this particular SIN. And in brief, we made no changes to those T's and C's. So those are unchanged. I mentioned earlier in the briefing low-level radioactive waste. And I think when you use that word radioactive, that gets a lot of people concerned. I know there's some history with contractors supporting federal agencies with this particular requirement. So what we wanted to do is just stress to make sure that the low-level radioactive waste removal has to do with a medical setting. I thought it was very helpful in examining the website from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, a government agency. They had a really good website on low-level waste, and the graphics or visuals on the right-hand side of the screen kind of help you get your mind wrapped around the different types of waste that you'd see at a hospital and their categorization into risk waste versus non-risk waste. The risk waste gives you some examples of the kind of things that a vendor may pick up and remove from a government facility like a hospital. And if you have requirements in this area, I really encourage you to take a look at that NRC website. So moving on to the next SIN discussion. This one is the first of the two new SINs that GSA added. This one is 524292-INS. It's linked to NAICS code 524292. The primary driver for introducing this new SIN had to do with requirements that GSA was seeing and hearing about from our customers and vendors regarding medical coding, medical building, and we didn't see a specific place or SIN where we could direct customers and of course in turn vendors. So this is what the new SIN description shows. On the right-hand side of the screen, similar to the hazardous waste SIN, you can see the mass terms and conditions that apply to this specific new SIN. Finally, moving on to the second of the SINs we added, I mentioned in my earlier remarks that this NAICS code or SIN is probably very familiar to all of you. It's very commonly used, 541990. I guess the the top level description or constraints that we would look at in terms of this one is it's services in the professional, scientific, and technical area that are not covered under existing SINs under MAS, which is why I think the SIN title included in parentheses the word non-IT. And you can see the SIN description has a brief list of examples of these kinds of services. Again, our market research was seeing a lot of spend unmanaged at the tier 0 and tier 1 levels. We wanted to make sure that this was an offering that was available under MAS professional services. And again, on the right-hand side in the box, you see the terms and conditions that apply to this specific SIN. So I think at this point, what I'd like to do is just take a quick pause, and before we take a look at some of the questions and answers that have come in, one of the things that I noticed when I came to GSA back in 2020, having been a customer of GSA, was just how many really capable people and reference points and resources GSA offers customers. And I just put a couple of links to websites. The first one is to our professional services website, where you can find out more about schedules. If you're doing market research and you're trying to find out by category, subcategory, what vendors are on schedule, GSA e-library is a great place to start. And we also have Interact and LinkedIn sites down there for you to keep in touch with us. So let me take a quick stop and check with my teammates and see what kind of questions have been coming in. Tim and Carla, can you give us an insight about what people are thinking about?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I have one open question right now, and that is, when will GSA start using 541.330 EMI when the scope of work is related to the military, weapons, and aerospace?
I don't have a quick answer for that one. If you send me an email message using the email that was on one of the earlier slides, william.neese@gsa.gov, I'd be happy to do some research internally on that one and get you a response.
All right, that's the only one. Of course, that's the only one that I see open at the moment.
Okay. All right. Well, what I'd like to do then is kind of move on to the end of the presentation. Again, Mass Refresh number 7 was rolled out by GSA at the very end of August of this year. So the question that many may ask is, well, okay, what's next? So at GSA, what we've got to do first and foremost with respect to the new SINs is to do outreach to our qualified vendors, both on schedule and not yet on schedule, and get them to add those SINs to their GSA MAS contract. Because that's the only way you as customers are going to be able to see them, take a look at their price lists, capability statements, and use those as part of your market research process. And secondly, we need to promote that these new SINs have been added, that the hazardous waste disposal SIN has been revised, and we need to promote those to federal agency customers like yourselves. So as we start into fiscal 22, Happy New Year, those are two primary efforts that GSA is going to be undertaking with respect to MAS professional services. At the top of the hour, Carla mentioned the PSHC office hours presentations. This is just kind of a preview looking into the future of the topic areas for the next webinars starting in November through March of next calendar year. And a reminder about the the start times and the audiences for these webinars and earning CLPs. Any other questions or comments that my panelists have, or any other questions from the audience?
I don't see any at the moment.
Okay, and I guess it's probably not speaking out of turn, but if you have ideas for topics that you'd like to see in addition to the ones on this slide, please shout out to us. Let us know what those are. We'd be happy to take a look at them and get back to you. And with that, Carla, I'd like to turn the presentation back to you as our moderator.
All right, this was a short and quick one. Thank you everyone for joining this month's professional services category office hours. I'm going to use the chat box to put in 2 upcoming webinars. What we have one coming up next week, and that is all about supply chain risk management. That's on October 20th at the same time at 1 p.m. And then we've got another office hours webinar, which is the same series as today. And the topic for that is FAR 8.4 and FAR 15, roles of each acquisition strategy. And that's on November 10th at the same time. I will go ahead and put the information for those 2 webinars in the chat box. So not the Q&A area, but in the chat box. And you can copy and paste those registration links if you are interested. But other than that, we thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. Thanks again, and have a wonderful rest of the day.